In a moment, we will have a panel discussion with Emer O'Neill, Director of Wave Goodbye to Dinosaurs, Ida Gonbier, Director of Journey of 1,000 Miles, Monica McWilliams, co-founder of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, who you saw in the clip, and Nala Valji, Senior Advisor in the Executive Office of the UN Secretary General. But before we go to our panel, I have the distinct honor of introducing to you our opening speaker, Miss Madeleine Rees, OBE. Ms. Rees is a British lawyer and Secretary General of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. She is known to most of you. She is a longtime fierce defender of human rights. She has brought cases to the European Court of Human Rights and the European Court in Luxembourg. In 1998, she was appointed as head of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and their gender expert in Bosnia-Herzegovina. From 2006 to 2010, she served as the head of the Women's Rights and Gender Unit for the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights again. And this list, of course, does not even really scratch the surface of a truly distinguished, remarkable career. I think we've all experienced that momentary delusion of grandeur where we might ask ourselves, I wonder who would play me in the movie. Well, for Madeleine Rees, such a question would be neither delusional nor hard to answer. Indeed, she was portrayed by none other than Vanessa Redgrave in the 2011 thriller, The Whistleblower. And with that fun fact, I have the opportunity, I get to say something I've always wanted to say. Madam Secretary General, the floor is yours.
I'd rather be the Secretary General I am than the Secretary General over the road. I get to do real fun things, like sitting next to Monica when she's making comments about the film and telling me who said what and what was being said off mic or on mic on occasion. I just briefly want to say my reaction to some of the work that has been done by the incredible directors and brought to us by Abigail Disney. I first saw Pray the Devil Back to Hell on my own. And I saw Wave Goodbye to Dinosaurs on my own. And I tried both times, because being British, we don't do that in public. Second time I saw it, Pray the Devil, it was in Geneva, where Wilf hosted a 1325 event. And it was one of those times where you didn't think there were going to be many people there. It was like 6 o'clock at night. It had been a long day at Human Rights Commission, as well as the Human Rights Council, sorry. And it was packed, it was absolutely packed. And Abigail was there, everyone watched the film, total silence at the end, everyone wasn't quite sure what to do, then there was obviously applause. And then we asked for comments, and the Swiss representative said, I'm just going to say how proud I am to be a woman. Which brought the UNICEF guy and said, and I'm so ashamed to be a man. And then I thought about that, because Abby really was very good. Watch it again and see what the good men are doing. She actually did deflate that sort of binary narrative. But then I thought, actually, that's what I had felt when I saw it and I cried on my own. It wasn't because I was upset by the films, it was because I was so proud that finally I was seeing something on a screen which reaffirmed everything I had seen from conflict countries and all the places I'd worked, where women had been doing so much, so brilliantly, for so long, and without there being any acknowledgement, and suddenly there it was. In Pray the Devil, we saw how the Liberian women had actually seized the narrative and changed the whole dynamic of conflict. In the Wave Goodbye to Dinosaurs, it was these brilliant women from Northern Ireland who worked together to actually make the changes in how the approaches to peace were going to happen. And then in the Bangladeshi clip we saw just then, the women who stepped up to become police officers did so because they were looking at the political economy of how their lives had been impacted by patriarchy. And they were going to do something about it. Now, if we take all of that together, we are creating an entirely different narrative. We are surfacing the reality of women's lives in relation to the very narrow vision we get shown, both in the media, in the United Nations, and elsewhere. We are seeing a different picture. And a picture which is actually so much better. None of these things came from nowhere. Women have been working on education, on healthcare, on violence against women in all of these countries for many, many years. And in the countries I've worked in too, same. They've been doing what we now like to call it political economy analysis from a gender perspective, which needs particular things done to try to change them. Now we have Security Council Resolution 1325 and the whole queue of resolutions that come after it. We've got to use that as a way of making sure that what these women have done stays permanently as part of that narrative so that we get a full picture of what is really happening in conflict. Because until we do that, we're going to be written out of history. The same with Bernadette Devlin when you see the film. She said, it's really never written in. And suddenly we can see now what a difference it would make. And I think the other thing that's really important is what a difference it makes to men. Because instead of that horrible binary gendered narrative of all men of Ireland and all women are peaceful, we actually see it in its reality of how men and women who want to build peace will build that peace together against the forces of violence which are directed by a media, a social media, by politicians and demagogues who drive us in directions which we don't want to go in ourselves. And that web that women have woven of working together socially in different and difficult contexts is where that narrative can now sit. So thank you so much to the makers of films. And more importantly, to the people who were the ones who were in the films, who made the reality. And thank you to all of you for being here and being part of this, because we've now got to transfer all of these messages over the road and tell the United Nations we want that difference. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Sarah Taylor. I am the Women, Peace and Security lead here at IPI. And this is a little bit of a confusing moment for me because I'm absolutely delighted to be on this stage with these amazing women, but I have to follow Madeline Race. So that's a little bit of a conundrum for me. In all seriousness, welcome. I would like to preface my introduction of our amazing panelists by saying that I've had the opportunity to see the full-length versions of both of these films, and they are everything you want them to be and are looking for. They're touching and inspiring and complex and incredible. So I'm going to stop talking momentarily and let the filmmakers and women peacemakers we have here speak for themselves. I will do a quick line of introductions, although for at least one person here, that seems mildly unnecessary given the clip that you've just seen. So I'll start with Monica Williams, who co-founded the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition Party, was in fact elected to the multi-party peace talks, and in fact became a signatory to the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, so I hope that's not a spoiler. In addition to this, she was a member of the Legislative Assembly and subsequently the Chief Commissioner for the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, was appointed to the Independent Reporting Commission on the disbandment of paramilitary organizations, has led workshops with women from conflict areas including Colombia, Syria, Myanmar, and the DRC, and is the author of a longitudinal study on intimate partner violence during and post-conflict. She is Emeritus Professor in the Transitional Justice Institute at Ulster University and a recipient of the John F. Kennedy Profile and Courage Award. Emir O'Neill is an award-winning Irish filmmaker working out of the Emmy-nominated Fine Point Film Studio in Belfast, Northern Ireland. She co-produced the 2018 Netflix Originals documentary Mercury 13, as well as Alex Gibney's No Stone Unturned, which is on Amazon. She's worked on films including Mea Maxima Culpa, Silence in the House of God, and Inez, A Challenging Woman. In 2016, she was selected for the British Film Institute LGBT Flair Filmmakers Mentorship, delivered with BAFTA. She is currently co-producing a new film for Universal Music Group about the world's most successful all-female rock band, the Go-Go's. Anyway, Ms. Ms. Geeta Ganbir is a director, producer, and editor. Her films have won 2 Emmys, 4 Peabodys, and an Oscar, along with many other awards. I Am Evidence, her film about the systemic nationwide failure to test rape kits, was honored at the 28 DuPont Awards after premiering at Tribeca Film Festival and airing on HBO. Most recently, she directed Steven Spielberg and Alex Gibney's documentary series, Why We Hate, on Discovery. Ms. Nella Valji is the Senior Gender Advisor in the UN Executive Office of the Secretary General, where, in addition to providing gender policy expertise, she coordinates the UN-EU Spotlight Initiative to eliminate violence against women and girls, and the Secretary General's Gender Parity Strategy. She also has one of these very long bios, which I'm going to cull slightly. Suffice to say, her extensive work in this area includes leadership of the Peace and Security section at UN Women, including heading the Secretariat for the Global Study on 1325, founding and managing the International Journal of Transitional Justice, co-editing the Oxford Handbook on Gender and Conflict, working in South Africa, leading the regional transitional justice work of the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation, and managing the African Transitional Justice Research Network. I know. So, that's all the talking you're basically going to hear from me. We're going to hear from our amazing panelists, and then we'll have time for question and answer with all of you. So, without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor to Monica, who I'm hoping will be able to enlighten us about not only some of the work that she did in the coalition and in the negotiations, but some of the lessons that she's learned from that process. Monica.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Thank you to IPI for inviting me to speak at this, and for showing the clips. It's amazing how your memory is brought back down again to all the things that happened and are still happening in a society that is now trying to make that transition from what I and many of the women in the coalition had experienced, which was 30 years of incredible violence. And as Anne said on the film, we knew that when that moment came that many things would be asked of us, and that peace was going to test us, and that we had to try and do something different. And that's the first thing I want to say, is that we were asked, where did these women come from? As if we'd fallen out of the clouds and suddenly appeared out of nowhere. We had been around for 25 years. The fact that somebody had asked that question in itself, as if women were hiding in a closet. And we actually said that we needed these networks. You can't just suddenly decide that you're going to enter peace talks. And we knew that civil society had engaged across the divide in ways that men couldn't, either because men would have been felt that they were going to be shot, and that women often felt, well, we will reach out because what's happening to our children is incredibly dangerous. And we called it joyriding. I think we now call it death riding, where kids were stealing cars, jumping into them at very early ages, and an enormous number of them were being shot. And it shows you how crazy they were when they would use one as a sandbag at the back of the car, so that if the bullets came, that kid would be the first to be shot. That's the kind of abnormality we were living. But we were ordinary women who fell into extraordinary times, and those networks came to the core. The solidarity that we had, despite our differences across the divide, we reached out and discovered we had commonality. Domestic violence, sexual violence, poverty, social and economic issues, putting bread on the table. Little wonder do we sing on International Women's Day, Bread and Roses. But we also had lots of joy and fun in coming together as women to make that decision. I remember the night when we found that slogan. We were asked in that big room, as big as this room, full of women, being very nervous, should we go for this? Because they had declared peace talks and said 10 parties would be at the table, and we worked it out, given those networks, that if we gathered enough votes across all our women's community, we would probably get to the table. But the question was, should we go to the table? And one half of the room said, don't do it. But you'll ruin everything that you've done so well in civil society, and you'll have blood in your hands. Because that's what politics was seen as, very bitter, very divided, keep people at it, keep the war going. And then a voice quietly shouted up, well, it's time to wave goodbye to dinosaurs. And the whole room went quiet. And do you remember, Anne, I was sent as the one to find out, did anybody ever hear of desktop publishing? This was 20 years ago. How do we find two dinosaurs? And I ran down the street, found a wee house, asked the person who everybody knew had a computer who could design dinosaurs, and I knocked his door and I said, I hear you can draw pictures of dinosaurs on your computer. And he said, what do you want them for? And I said, I'll tell you after you draw them. So he drew them, I took the picture off him, I said, thanks very much, it's for a political party. He slammed the door and I never saw him again. And that's the story of those terrible posters, but that's what women do. We went to Stranges, we had some creativity, we had a lot of curiosity about the other side, and we took those risks and entered it. So, if peace is about doing something different, then what do women bring to the table? The process was very tough, it went on for 2 years. We prepared every night before we went to the table. That's the other thing we did, because we were so apprehensive about what we were doing. It was very much around our own kitchen tables, because we had children and we had domestic responsibilities as well as political responsibilities. But it was that team effort, that solidarity between us. We broke ourselves up into teams. We didn't go after this leader notion that only one of us could be a leader. And the leadership grew amongst all of us. But the value we brought to the table was, what does peace look like? And those were the questions. Anne, who's here tonight, had started up a school in her own area to bring children to be educated together. We call it integrated education. When we looked at the final agreement, we said there's nothing in this about bringing children together for the future to be educated. And many others said, never forget it. I'm walking out of here if that doesn't make its way into the final agreement. And I said, well, we feel so strongly about this, we need to get it in. Shared accommodation, issues about how we were going to deal with our young people in the future. A whole chapter we wrote on reconciliation and on victims, because armed groups were at the table. And they said to us, as we know, we can't put anything in on victims because we'll be seen as hypocrites. And we already had understood the problem with victims and what we needed to put in, and I'm so glad we did. Because we wouldn't have got through the referendum, where it went to the people, the agreement, if the people in the country hadn't seen that we had taken time to discuss what we would do on victims, and we're still struggling with that. Finally, I want to say that civil society should be there before, during and after peace talks. And there was the lesson for us. Once the peace agreement was signed, we were told to go home. The job was done, the lads had to sort out who was sharing power with who, and that was it. And so there's a lesson there, in that what's promised needs to get enforced. So always think about the day after. We have done the DDR, the demobilisation, the disarmament, the reintegration of prisoners, all the hard stuff. But we haven't done what people think is the soft stuff, which is sustainable peace in terms of those issues of education, youth, community development, social and economic issues. The Bill of Rights, which I was responsible for drafting, is still outstanding despite today we've got Brexit hanging over us and we may have no fundamental rights to fall back on. So that's the kind of story, and the final lesson is what's promised needs to be enforced. You saw some men saying some terrible things on that, and what I was whispering to Madeline was that's what they said then. They were caught on camera saying it. It was quite shocking. I suppose cameras tell a lot. They were kind of named and shamed as a result, and those men also changed during the process. The one in particular with the moustache was a leader of an armed group. I reached out to, the women invited him and his comrades to our kitchen tables, and we sat down and found out about their lives. Because if you're going to negotiate, you need to know who you're negotiating with. So reaching an accommodation is a strength, not a weakness. Talking to your enemy is a strength, not a weakness. Taking those risks for peace, and it paid off. I became a signatory on Good Friday over 20 years ago, and I'm still today working as hard to implement that peace as they did on Good Friday. And I said that day that we'd interrupted the culture of failure. I hope we'd never go back. I've discovered pieces, well, I knew that the piece would be built piece by piece. It's an unfinished business, and I suppose I'll be pushing up the daisies, still struggling to make that piece work. Thank you.
Monica, thank you so much. And now you have the floor.
Thanks to IPI and Pieces Loud. It's a pleasure to be here. So many renowned and experts in the room. There's much to deeply learn from. One of the issues that I wanted to talk about here today was effectively Madeleine's a hard act to follow. But you mentioned a quote that's in We've Divided Dinosaurs from Bernadette Devlin McAlassie, who said, "It's not that women get written out of history, they never get written in." And when I was making this documentary with all the Women's Coalition members, that theme just resonated for me. It's Monica spoke extensively there about our peace agreement in Northern Ireland, and it was for the children. It was to improve their futures. I was 10 years old in 1996 when you all formed. I was 12 when the Good Friday Agreement was signed. So I am a product of the Good Friday Agreement. I'm now 33. My life has been fulfilled by peace. We're not necessarily a reconciled place, but there's still a lot of work to do. But the biggest thing about directing a film like this is I always ask myself, what can we learn? What can the audience learn, and what can I learn? When you talk about the Good Friday Agreement, there's always one thing left out, and that is how women actively participated in its creation. They're never mentioned. You're never mentioned. Anne Carr is here tonight, who is also one of the 70 women who put her hand up. And that bothered me. When I was at school in history and politics class, I was not taught the story of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition. I wasn't that familiar with it at all. And I felt a responsibility with Fork Films and Fine Point Films in Belfast to, effectively write your story into our local history, but also internationally. The talks took 2 years, but decades of activism. It's hard to follow Monica too, but those networks that you're referring to, women were building and running communities back home. You were carrying out peace building on a daily basis. It's that experience that when the British government and Irish governments announced there were going to be peace talks, it was only 6 weeks that 70 women got together in the space of 6 weeks and created an all-female party and got elected and sent 2 women, Monica and Pearl, to the talks. You can see in some of the footage they are the only 2 women with seats at the table. It's bizarre to think, as being a woman today in Northern Ireland, that there was a risk that peace was going to be negotiated only by men. Where's our voices? Where are we going to be reflected in that? Obviously, the Women's Coalition had to endure a lot of abuse, and as Monica said, by the end of the process, a lot of reconciliation had happened between those who were verbally abusive and those who then actually had seen the humanity, not just between Catholic and Protestant, but also between men and women. The role of media is a huge issue. I do believe we have to write women into history, and we have to tell stories that are untold, but that we can deeply learn a lot from. The story of Women's Coalition is 20 years old, but when you look at America today and the context that many of us are living in, there's more women than ever been elected to the House of Representatives. There is a desire for female voices that are relentless, that are outspoken, that want to talk about issues and policies that are going to affect our day-to-day lives. When you hear that, you can't help but be attracted towards it. And I think what all this boils down to as a filmmaker is generationally, the Women's Coalition members are older than I, but there's a lot to learn from each other. It is trying to work out, when you tell your story, you tell these wonderful stories, what is it we can learn? What can I learn, and what can I take back to the streets of Belfast? But also, when on March 25th, when Wave Goodbye to Dinosaurs was on PBS, what can an American audience learn from the story? And for me, it was defined in one of the clips by Jane Wilde, who said, exposing your identity is very difficult, especially in a place where identity is linked to danger and to violence. What you have all taught me is that in order to effect change, you have to expose your identity. You have to be willing to speak out. You have to hold your head up. You have to take to the street if necessary, or you have to go across the road and you have to demand, and don't take no for an answer. It sounds very easy, especially coming from myself, but you have taught me that you have to say no, and that you have to ask and demand that change can happen. That is what I hope America takes from Wave Goodbye to Dinosaurs. I think wherever we are in the world, where you can wave goodbye to dinosaurs, you should, and where you haven't been able to just yet, start waving.
Thank you so much. I'm furiously taking notes. I won't try to summarize. I might actually just point to a panel I was on with Anne earlier today to tie the bow on this part of the conversation before we move to the other clip, which is that she spoke about women's engagement in this process as envisioning what a society needs to be, what a society at peace with itself needs. And that was the approach to that work that you all did. Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security has at its core participation, and that is in peace processes. It's also in all efforts to create and maintain peace, to prevent conflict, to sustain peace. The second clip that we saw is another story that that doesn't get told. Another place in which women's role is not reflected, is not written into history. So, Geeta, please tell us about this incredible movie with the Bangladeshi all-female police unit.
Sure. Thank you so much.
Okay, I think it's on now. So thank you so much for having us here today, and it's a huge honor. And I also feel very impressed and intimidated by the company I'm in. But it's really a pleasure, and I'll try to follow up everyone who came before. I think my co-director and co-producer, Sharmeen Obaid-Chinoy, who is a two-time Oscar winner and is based in Pakistan, so she couldn't be here today. She and I decided to make this film because we were really troubled by the portrayal of Muslim women in the media, particularly in Western media, at the time this film was made, and we continue to be troubled. But it felt to us that the portrayal of Muslim women was mostly around they were being portrayed as victims or voiceless or as aiding and abetting extremist groups and terrorism. I mean, it was sort of a one-dimensional sort of vision of them, and we really felt it was important to tell complex stories about women from our part of the world as having agency and full lives, and so this story really, we read an article, I think, about women who were being deployed from India to Liberia a couple of years prior, and that was really inspiring to us. And we were deeply interested in women as part of the peace process too. When we found out about the women from Bangladesh that were being deployed to both Haiti and Congo at the time, that was even more interesting because these are predominantly Muslim women, and again, a story that we felt we'd never heard about and wasn't receiving any sort of coverage. So that's why we chose this story. And I think what we discovered in being on the ground with these women was really not only the impact they had on on essentially their mission and on the communities that they were interacting with, but we also really learned what it meant for them as women from a patriarchal traditional culture. Even though Bangladesh has made great leaps in recent years, there is still a tremendous amount of work to be done. And these are women who, again, came from again, came from traditional backgrounds, had often never left the area that they grew up in, some had never even been on a plane before. And what did it mean for them to serve in a community such as existed in Haiti at that time, in post-conflict and post-disaster zones? So that was of great interest to us. And I think some of the things that, at the time the UN had the initiative to try to recruit more women into the peacekeeping forces. The women we followed were police, and they were a formed police unit. And so at the time, I think I'll just rattle off some of the things that were, I'm sure many of you here know, but that were, we had heard were important to having women in the peacekeeping forces, and basically the role that they could serve. So essentially there was the concept, what we understood was that having women in the peacekeeping forces and participating in the process could empower women in the host community. They could address the specific needs of female ex-combatants during the process of demobilizing. Haiti was not a conflict zone, but a post-disaster zone. So some of these didn't really apply, but they could basically help make the peacekeeping force more approachable to women in the community. They were able to assist and aid in interviewing survivors of gender-based violence. They were also able to interact in societies where women were prohibited from speaking to men. They also helped to reduce conflict and confrontation, improve access and support for local women, provide role models, as I mentioned before, provide a greater sense of security to local populations, including women and children, and broaden the skill set available within a peacekeeping mission. When we arrived in Haiti, as sometimes happens when you're making a film, the story you think you're going to tell is not the story that happens at all. And so the women, we were with them during their training process, which was quite short. And then when they arrived in Haiti, they were confronted with the MINUSTA mission at the time was extremely troubled. There was they were met head on with the cholera epidemic, and they were met head on with a lot of anger and protests, and which had been built, and the anger had been building over the 10 years prior to their arrival. So I will say that they were not well prepared for what they encountered on the ground, and because women in Bangladesh often are put into administrative positions in their home country, their training was also for the duties that they were meant to do, which was crowd control, public safety, patrolling. They were not necessarily well prepared. They didn't have the skills, particularly when it came to weapons handling, and ideally the weapons were not to be used, but only in defense, but yet they were still very unfamiliar. So there were some issues that we were met head on with that were quite challenging to the women and also to us as a team, because it took us by surprise, some of the things that we were met with. What was interesting, though, is the women received additional training on the ground, which they were very, very willing and excited to take part in. And over the course of the year, we were really able to watch them grow. And I think that was something, so that experience is what I want to talk about a little bit, is the women, to see them sort of blossom over the course of the year and really step up. And also what they took away from the mission and back home was almost as important as what we saw when it came to their impact on society. So as far as their impact, we definitely saw a difference in the way that the women interacted with the communities that they interfaced with. The women, one of the things I thought that we found really interesting is the women themselves, being from Bangladesh, which is an economically poor country, when they arrived in Haiti, their understanding of the struggles of the community was incredibly deep. Basically when they interacted with the people, they realized the basis of the anger and the frustration that was often about systemic poverty and corruption, that was implicit. And they were not, in some ways, their response to then protests and oftentimes to to people being hostile towards them, to communities being hostile towards them, was met with understanding. And an example of that, and sometimes these examples are very small, but they're very important in trust building. There was an example where at one of the places where the women patrolled, they would and guarded, there were children who would come, teenage boys who would throw rocks at the women. And they would stand behind, the women were fenced off, so there was a fence, but these boys would come and stand on the other side of the fence and throw rocks at them. Some were fairly large rocks. We were there some of the time. You know, they could damage the vehicles and people could be injured. One woman was hit in the head with a rock and had to be taken to the hospital. And it was, you know, so the injuries could be fairly serious. The male peacekeepers that the other FPUs would question why the women didn't arrest them. The women, and why didn't they, you know, pursue them? Why didn't they arrest them? Why didn't they sort of take more aggressive action against them? And the women's response was, they're children, and they're hungry, and they're frustrated, and we're not going to arrest them. They won't learn to trust us. They will think that we are just like everyone else, and we're not interested in doing that. They have to learn to trust us. If we can't, you know, if they will not, if we respond with force and violence, then we are just like everyone else who's come before. So the women instead put up nets around their guard posts, and they tried to interact with the kids. And after a while, it diffused the situation. It took maybe a few months, but that, I think, the history again of police violence in Haiti, with the Haitian National Police already, you know, that precursor was, I think, what was expected from the community. And then there were obviously there were scandals and that came out around the peacekeeping units that were there that did respond with violence. And as many of you know, there are allegations of sexual abuse. And the women basically, so their response was different. We also noticed that when they patrolled camps there, that when the male peacekeepers would patrol the camps, the women and children would go inside and not come out. And when the women patrolled the camps, the women and children would come out and follow them and walk through the camps with them and want to hold their hands and want to talk to them. And after all, the women would sometimes bring little treats for the children. They would try to interact with them. They would play games with them as much as they could. There was a language barrier. There was often an interpreter. But so it was that was really inspiring for us to see. It was just a difference in the way that they were handling the situation. And at the end, when they left, there was a familiarity and a trust built within the community. And then very quickly, because I'm over talking, I'm going to tell you guys about what I saw with the women themselves and what they experienced. So what we saw is for the women themselves, they were able to broaden their skills and capacity and bring some of what they learned home, which included community policing, diffusing conflict, and how to interact, you know, with communities in sort of a better way to sustain peace. Some of the other things that they learned as well. They also experienced, coming from a traditional background, a lot of the women experienced a freedom that they did not have at home. They were able to bond with each other. They were able to work together. They were given responsibilities they didn't have at home. And they also, in some ways, some of them were very happy to be free of the burden of childcare and the cooking and those sort of things. So they really, you know, for them, that was a sort of a joyful thing, even though they missed their families terribly. They were able to, the money that they made on this mission was 3 times what they would make at home. So they were effectively the breadwinners coming from Bangladesh. And so that really made a difference to them. They were able to support their families and become sort of role models for their own children. The little boy in the film who you saw said of his mother, when we went back and asked him what he thought about, you know, his mother being away for so long, he said, when I grow up, I want to be a big shot police officer like my mother. Even though his father was a police officer, it was his mother that he saw as the example. And I think too, women's work is a way to combat patriarchy. Women being financially independent and having the ability to sustain themselves and their family is key to, again, to changing the narrative. And so I think in conclusion, I think one of the things that we learned from this is also just the fact that, as Audre Lorde said, the great Audre Lorde said, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And when you think of the master's tools in these circumstances, it is patriarchy and systemic violence. So I think when we think about what we have to do differently to sustain peace, it's about bringing something else to the table.
I was devastated that we couldn't show all of both movies. I'm really sorry to cut you off because I will always want to talk about Audre Lorde and the part dismantling the patriarchy. Nala, you have the role of final comments, insights, thoughts on this fascinating topic.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And let me first just begin by saying that you don't come after an incredible panel like this, which includes a movie star. Monica, you've always been a rock star to those of us who work in this area. You're now a movie star as well. And two movie directors and a keynote from Madeleine Reese, and have anything to say that's going to be new or as eloquent as what's already been said. But perhaps just a few wrap-up thoughts, Sarah, as you suggested. The first thing to say is I'm so excited, and I can't wait to see the rest of these films. In my previous role at UN Women, one of the things, and Sarah actually partnered with us on this, we used to we used to provide an information setting to new Security Council members as they came onto the Council on women, peace and security, and what is this agenda and why is it relevant to the Security Council. And we actually used to use a clip from Pray the Devil Back to Hell. And it was just such a powerful tool to communicate the message of why women's participation was so crucial, and why the Women, Peace and Security agenda is at its heart about peace and security. And I think, as it was said in the movie, this is not about women's issues. This is fundamentally about inclusive peace and sustainable peace and security. And I think we can all agree, Sarah, you spoke about participation being at the heart of 1325 in this agenda. I think we can all agree that women's equal participation and representation is simply a basic human right. And we should be able to leave it there. That should be the end of the discussion. But the reality is that there is an incredible impact on our operational effectiveness on peace and security by women's meaningful participation and representation. We know this, we have the evidence, but we continue to exclude women regardless. And I think one of the missing pieces for us, perhaps, is the need to find a new way of communicating. We need to find a new way of communicating this evidence, one that impacts in the emotional way that these films do. And I think that the power of these movies is exactly as the directors have said, showcasing what has become our talking points over the years. We can talk about the way in which female peacekeepers access communities differently, the way in which it impacts our credibility, the way in which it increases the reporting of sexual and gender-based crimes, how it builds different kinds of relationships with the communities. But until you see that, until you see the women patrolling and the women and children coming out to follow them, until you see those relationships being built in front of you, I don't think we fully understand the impact that we can have through women's meaningful participation. It's the same thing with peace talks. We can talk about the different perspectives that women bring to the table, why it is that women's impact is not because they're inherently peaceful, it's because they build different kinds of coalitions. They bring different issues to the table. They bring community issues to the table, so that when peace talks hit bumps, as they inevitably will, it has national ownership. It has the ownership, it has the peace dividend that is needed to see that process through. But until you see it in the way that it's evidenced through the Women's Coalition and the Northern Ireland peace process, I don't think that really comes to light or hits home in the way that one-dimensional talking points really just can't. And so this is one of the reasons why, for this Secretary General, the issue of gender parity has been such a crucial part and such a priority from his first days in office, is because the reality is that women's participation shifts institutions, changes the conversation, and makes our efforts on everything from development to human rights to peace and security that much more effective. And I've heard some say that we focus too much on women's participation and too much on the gender parity issue. I think that these movies demonstrate the reason for that. But I want to just end with one additional thought on this, because there's 2 books by my bedside at the moment. And I can't claim to have read as much of them as I should have, but I can tell you from the book flaps exactly. The first one is called Why Incompetent Men Get Promoted and What We Can Do About It. And the second one is called The Gender Gap in Data. And why are these 2 books relevant here? Because I actually think that they present to us in a different light the very things that these movies are showing us. The first is, in talking about why incompetent men get promoted, the point is not about incompetent men. The point is actually about what are the leadership attributes that we prioritize. And as a result of that, what are the impacts and the outcomes in terms of our institutions, in terms of our decision making that result from that? So we have prioritized certain ways of leadership, of power over, of a certain representation of authority rather than relationship building, that has given us the kind of leadership that we see, that has prioritized in many respects, and many of our civil society colleagues here say this, the issue of militarization over development. That leads us to many of the peace and security challenges that we face today. And I think what was so amazing to see in these movies, and as Gita, you just talked about as well, is the role models that women present and the impact that has far beyond their own situation, on their children, on their communities, on society more generally. In Liberia, we often talk about how the all-female unit that went into Liberia led to a complete uptick in women joining the security sector in Liberia. Because just that powerful role modeling shows us that it is possible. So that's the first. I think that women's participation shifts how it is that we define leadership. It role models a different way of being. But it also brings 50% of the world's population and their diverse perspectives to the table. And that is where the second book on gender gap in data comes in. Did you know that women are 45% more likely to die in a car crash than a man? That's because until 2011, our crash test dummies were based solely on an average 70-kilo man. We think about the world through one lens. And the outcome of that is literally life and death. And it is particularly life and death when we're talking about issues of peace and security. So I'm going to end it there, but just to say that I think these movies are such a powerful way of translating the contribution of 100% of our population to our sustainable peace and security, and to modeling and to redefining what leadership and representation looks like.
Thank you, Nala. It's all I can do to not go on Amazon and start Googling those books. I'm going to just move straight into opening the floor to question and answer. I'm sure that there's plenty of you who have something to comment on or ask a question about. I'll take 3 questions from the audience, and then we'll come back to our panelists. Who would like to take the mic first? We have mics in the back of the room. It's a very shy, retiring crowd. Any other? No points? I mean, I have questions if you want me to get things started. So I actually do have a question for the panelists that stretches across both of the films. And there's been a lot of discussion about the creativity that was required, about stepping forward when you hadn't stepped forward before, but basing that on the sort of long-term history of women at the community level. The women in your film are experienced police officers, but in their communities, and this is about, the risks that women take or tend to take in entering these particular spheres. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to some of the tensions that caused for the women themselves. This is something that comes out very clearly, or not very clearly, but is sort of more explicit in the film that you made. I'm wondering if there's any reflections that you want to make across the board about what that looked like, whether it was the changes that it incurred for their own personal lives, whether positive, negative, or somewhere in between. I'd love to hear the reflections on that.
I mean, I can quickly say, I think my film, because it was what we call a verite film, where we were following the women in real time. We saw it play out over the course of the year. And so Maushami, who was one of the women that we followed, her husband was actually very supportive. He said that women, so just so we don't stereotype all men as being horrible and and completely sexist, he was he was excited about her going. He was exhausted when she got back, but he believed in women's work. And his wife, he married a woman who was actually higher in rank than him, and had very little trouble with it. So he was a great example of, a supportive person in that relationship. The other woman, Farida, who joined the police, her father had been a constable and didn't want her to join. He knew how challenging it would be for her. She had direct trouble with her husband, who was a businessman, wanted her to stay home and basically be a trophy wife, and wanted her to quit her job, and didn't understand why she felt she had to go abroad and maintain her work. But Farida, having been through the loss of her father already, and also she lost her current husband is her second husband, but she lost her first husband as well, absolutely understood how critical it was for her to be financially independent, and to how much her work meant to her. She understood that being dependent on a man meant at any point they could leave or you could lose them, and then you and your family might be on the street. So that was, for us, we had to watch. There was a lot of conflict in her relationship, but the one thing she was very clear about through the whole thing was that she would not give up her work. When she decided to go on the peacekeeping mission, her husband didn't speak to her for 3 months. Like, he was so angry at her, and that continued, but she didn't give it up, and I don't think she ever will, frankly.
What we found was something similar. None of these experiences are unique. You find a commonality across all conflicts about what happens to women when they step forward, and that's a very good question, because it's not just how the men in mainstream politics relate to women who are coming in to invade their space, but it's also the men at home, and will they support the women who are stepping up and stepping out? Some do and some don't. And what we've learned from South Africa in the research on violence against women was a lot of those men felt, what's the word when the women take over? Emasculated. And I heard that word over and over again, particularly in our reform in policing. When we went in to do the training around changes on policing, you heard two things: that the peace agreement has made our police into wimps. So we asked them to change from being a police force to a police service, and that was emasculating them. And so there was a whole lot of training had to go on in decommissioning those mindsets. Not just decommissioning the weapons, but decommissioning how that culture was going to change. And that's institutionally, but also at home. And we learned from what the women in South Africa were telling us, that a lot of violence started to be used against them.
All meeting rooms should be ending in 5 minutes. Reminder, all meeting rooms should be ending in 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
I thought that was a message from Westminster saying that Brexit was now resolved. And so personally, it is really important to not just have champions out there, which I now know the UN are looking for in terms of emancipation of women.
Well, I guess you just thank you very much.
Oh, he's given us a bit longer. So, personally, in our lives change radically when we take on these roles, and I know that because I was also a mother with very small children. So you have to negotiate with your partner in a way probably that men who had those roles didn't expect that they would have to negotiate with their partners. And what I used to watch was when we had to go away from home, a lot of the women were on their phones all the time reassuring their husbands that they weren't in bed with some man from the other side. And actually for me too, it was a huge issue in that when I was seen to be reaching out to this man who was on the other side and who people thought, why is she talking to him because he's a leader of an armed group, and why is she becoming so friendly with him? Suddenly heard all these rumours that I was having an affair with him. And all that we women have is our reputations. And that's the way to go out, come after us, to strip us of our reputations. The way I got round that was his wife was a great friend of mine, so any photographer that came anywhere near us with a camera, I would grab his wife and start talking like this. But I mean, that's extra work. That's extra thinking all the time that you have to do on top of your job. So both personally and politically, I think we work extra hard in our lives to try and keep our homes together, to try and make sure that our kids don't say, well, you were never there. And as probably I take my hat off to women who are able to go away for a whole year and come back. And we change enormously, us women who do step up or step out. But for our kids, we have to be still mummy. And often the care of our elderly parents or whoever. So I think those are the things that keep us out. They used to say it was 4 C's. We have less cash, we have less confidence, and it was also about our culture. But it was also about childcare. And when we tackle all 4 together, we know we're getting somewhere.
Just really, really just in terms of risks for peace, I think many people can take for granted the risks that women do take in trying to get this film made. You know, I was often told it's just a bunch of women. You know, that was 20 years ago. You know, we kind of know that story, but actually we didn't. It was challenging locally in Northern Ireland to actually reinforce what the Women's Coalition had done and had achieved. The film aired 2 years ago on the BBC, and when it did so, we were delighted with the reviews. But the reviews were mainly saying, I thought I knew this party, but in watching this film, I took for granted actually everything they did. You talk, you know, about decommissioning and going into the prisons and everything that you did, which was hugely brave. But what I wanted to do more than anything was actually show in that meeting, in that room where you all put your hands up, that was the moment of intense bravery. Because it was, if you can see from the archive, it was incredibly patriarchal, it was incredibly male dominated. It just, you know, the audacity that you can negotiate a peace settlement for a country with just male voices. You know, the statistic about 45% of women are more likely to get killed in a car crash, that's just unacceptable. You know, we just have to start questioning in our day-to-day lives, what are these moments where, you know, how are we looking at issues? It's just frustrating when you're a woman making stories about women. It just seems to be at times gratuitous and you know, quite worthy. But it's ultimately the learning. When you get in rooms like this, albeit very intimidating, there's always an energy that's created. There's an energy that you want to go out and you want to try and affect some change. Those risks for peace are what we have to learn from, but it's our generation that has to try and push that forward more and more each day. It's not enough just to talk about these issues. It's not enough to watch the film and tweet about it. Oh, please do that. But it's what actually do you do to try and make a difference, albeit minor or albeit huge. You took the risks. We have to take more risks, and together we have to, risk everything in order just to have common sense. And I just think that's what's ultimately missing.
Yeah. Nala, did you want to?
No. But now I have more questions.
Please, there's a microphone.
My question has to do with when you went to Haiti or you went to South Africa, how did you influence the women there to maybe take on the same kind of roles in terms of being into the military? What effect did that have on those women?
So, full confession, my question was about cross-learning as well. So, yeah, it's about, you referenced that. So, please, Monica.
The women in South Africa taught us everything, not the other way around. We came home completely different people after we came home from South Africa. We learned so much from them. I mean, my sister who's with me here and I have worked together in a lot of different conflicts, and we both leave every one of those saying our batteries are recharged. And first you find the commonality amongst each other, and it's very liberating to hear that they've been through the same experiences, and they give you a lot of tactics. I mean, we talk about analysing a situation, organising it, strategising, and South Africa had gone before us. And in fact, I'm going to write a book about how important South Africa was to our process. Because here it was, a country in the global south, teaching this so-called, as Mandela said to us, you're all white, you're all so-called Christians, you all speak English, and you really do hate each other. Now listen to us. And that's what we did. We listened for 3 days. We were locked up in a military camp out in the Eastern Cape. And we had a ceasefire 4 weeks after we came home. That's how profound that listening was. That's how profound that exchange was. And we took those concepts back into our talks. They had a concept called the sufficiency of consensus, which wasn't putting up your hands and counting the numbers as they're a majority. They went round the room, and in South Africa it was different tribal leaders and different tribal groups and civil society. Is there a consensus? Nobody could exercise a veto, but it was the sufficiency. We, the women, took that home, and we said it has to be a sufficient number of us small parties from civil society as well as the big parties, and when we have a sufficient number, that's consensus, and let's move forward. That's what we took. Many other examples. Exchanges are extremely important, and you always come home with more than what you think you're bringing there.
I think I would just say as well that one of the things, we had an event last night and there were some incredible women there, and one of them said that the women on the ground always know what they need. It's not that we have to also deconstruct this colonial mentality that we're going in to save them, even no matter where we're from, right? The women on the ground absolutely oftentimes they're already organizing, right? They already have strategies in place. What they need is support. They need resources. They need people to come in and say, how can we help you with what you're already doing? What do you need? Tell us what you need. And we're here, we're here to do that. We're not here to tell you how you should be running things, because oftentimes they've already survived a conflict, or they're living through it. They're living through a disaster. So that's, I think, one of the key things is that oftentimes it's about those, I think, and about those issues. And I think what Monica said is so key to that. To go in and listen and then respond is probably the most important thing.
Hi, thank you. 2 nights in a row to have the pleasure to hear you. I think all of us have said how there's nothing more impactful than hearing from the national stakeholders that went through something, that led something on the ground, that could speak in personalized ways to it, and how you've captured in film many of those in-country scenarios. And yet, as Naha maybe raised about the messaging, how when we think about the upcoming juncture of 20 years, 1325, so much of what the Security Council gets and what the international community consumes are, you know, SG reports written by internationals or Security Council members talking among themselves, mostly men. We have area formula where we have NGOs more and more coming in. But in all my years here, I think what we have missed out on not being more creative and engaging women like you to engage in the forum of the Security Council and to share experiences, and for the UN to use you more in terms of facilitating exchanges with women in other areas. And so I wanted to raise, maybe it's not my business, but a question of whether the people in this room and what you think of as we approach the 20th anniversary, and we've been in many of those 1325 meetings where you have pre-prepared statements from capitals read out one after the other, no interactive discussion. And I hope that we're not going to hear that on the 20th anniversary, whether we might think and engage and take advantage of incredible women on the ground. And I've seen it in every place I've gone. You've seen it, any of us who have worked in conflict zones. And I think it's a pity that we don't let them tell their story, which could be so impactful on decision makers in the council and the legislative bodies, but also inspiring to other stakeholders going through it, and to all of us, to motivate us to be more committed and to understand it better. So that's, I'd be interested in what you think of that.
Thank you, Nina. Another, there's one right here. And there, and then I'll.
Women played so many powerful roles in peace processes. And quite often those peace processes, as part of them is then an election to a constituent assembly or a legislative assembly, and so many women get cut out through those elected processes. What can be done as part of the general peace process as a whole and women's work in terms of developing peace processes and working on them to ensure then that as many women as possible run for those elections once they come, and that as many women as possible get elected into those elected bodies?
And then we'll come back to the. I'm sorry, I was pointing to. Sorry, I pointed to.
Thank you very much. It's been really inspiring to listen to all of you. So this goes to McWilliams. I'm actually from South Sudan, and the women in South Sudan were part of the recently concluded peace process. And one of the things that was guaranteed was a 35% quota for women at all levels of government. But one of the pushbacks that we get is that there are no qualified women to occupy these positions. There are qualified women, but they're just not in political parties. So when you brought it up in the room that you were not going to run as you were not going to be civil society, but to become a political party, what did it take for you to convince the other women to join you in waving goodbye to the dinosaurs?
We are touching upon so many dimensions that I'm always feeling hesitant about bringing the future in. What is your evaluation of the intergenerational effects of all of these efforts? You sort of alluded that when you specified that you are the younger generation, but how many of you are there?
That's a good question.
And I'll just say we're running out of time, so I'll
Okay.
just do a
Briefly.
sweep through across. So.
Excellent questions. Election processes, hugely important. Ours was very creative. Why was it creative? Because they wanted the armed groups to come to the table. So they created a process that 10 parties would go, knowing that 2 of the small armed groups who formed the political parties would get there. We women sat down and said, well, we could do that. We could become one of the 10, which goes to your question, which do we want to be? And that was the hard question. But the process was so creative that it didn't demand a huge number. We just formed a kitchen table campaign. We asked 100 women to go out and get 100 votes. We knew 10,000 would get us across the threshold. It was unique in some senses. It was context specific. Every context is different. So today you talk about
parallel gender committees, and Colombia did it differently, and South Africa did it differently. We found a way through it. The window of opportunity opened up, and it was, yeah, we jumped, but we jumped very nervously because we weren't sure what we'd find on the other side. Remember, we didn't care whether we got elected or not. How many people who run for office say that? And half of the women ran anonymously. Nobody knew their names because it was a party, it was a team that ran. And so we fought hard the last nights to maintain that system, and nobody would support us. And we said, that again shows you, if you don't have creativity around your electoral processes, what happens is, they all want to go back to what they know best. And what we knew best didn't work. We wanted them to try something different. And if that didn't work, we said, let's have some affirmative action. Let's have some temporary special measures. We didn't get that either. We sure as hell got it for religion, for Catholic and Protestants, but you weren't going to get it for men and women. You weren't going to get it for the police force, police service. Every person that was going to be recruited in future, they had to have a 50% quota that they would be Catholic, because it was so underrepresented. It was also underrepresented by women, but did anybody care to introduce a gender quota for that? Not at all. So those are examples that we learned from. We made mistakes. Had we to go back, I think we would have fought harder to keep, because everybody was allowed one thing, we would have fought harder to get an election process that was inclusive, and would have kept everybody who made the agreement implementing the agreement. And that was the first mistake. But you always learn. Instead, we went for a civic forum, because we said if women can't get in the door by political representation, then perhaps they can get in through civic representation. So we created and proposed, and it was agreed, that there would be a citizens' assembly established that would address cultural, economic and social issues. It was agreed, it was implemented, it was stood up for 2 weeks, and the political party said we don't need it anymore, stand it down. And it's never come back. So there's a lesson about what's agreed and promised must be enforced, and that's the way we would have brought not just new women in, but young people from the disability sector, from the ethnic minority sector. And what we got was male pale and what is it they say? Steel.
Male pale and steel.
Yeah, and that's what we got. We learned, we made mistakes, and we learned from it. So affirmative action, temporary special measures and things like that do work, and they are beginning. Ireland has now just introduced both the Citizens' Assembly, but also in every political party will get extra funding if they can prove that in future they will have 40% of women running as candidates. And so that's what they, by law. Others, like Scotland, have women-only lists. I think the Labour Party also has that. So your question about convincing other women, yeah, that was tough, because some of these women were in other parties. We were so inclusive that we actually said, don't give up your membership of other parties, but come and join us also. That's the kind of coalition we were. You couldn't have thought of a more diverse group of people. On that film, if you had put underneath it, it would have said far right, far left, middle of centre, centre of left, centre of right. That was the kind of group that we, and as someone who had to, we didn't ever use the word leader, but as someone who had to kind of take that forward, it was tough decision making. But we knew that when we went into the room, if we'd agreed amongst ourselves what we were bringing to the table would eventually stand up, because we'd worked so hard the nights before to get that diversity of opinion. Intergenerational, Emer has to speak about that. Coming to New York last night was lovely for me, because Emer said something that I was able to go to bed and think, well, I did something right, which was that Emer said that what she watched from us and passed it on, because I am now the older generation trying to pass the baton, was that she became a feminist, or was a feminist, but a stronger one, and was also a woman who realised that equality mattered. She knew that already, but was prepared to stand up. And also the most important words were about the importance of human rights and equality in her life, and to make those political. That these were not dirty issues anymore in our country. If we can do that for our next generation, I'll sleep easy in my bed in future.
I'm joking, Monica. Monica could just answer that question by saying Emer said, but we're there. I mean, you know, women are half of the population, but like for me right now, Greta Thunberg, like what a young woman in Sweden. Her eyes, her stare, her glare, what she is saying in very black and white terms. There is no grey. This is her planet. It is on fire. We need to listen. This is her future. You know, she's much, much younger than I, but I'm already even seeing in someone so young and so formidable. And I'm delighted that a lot of the media are starting to listen and that her voice has been very clear and coherent. Those cases are isolated, but I just think the more examples we have of other women who have done it, the more confident we feel. It's not nice to say, but sometimes I often feel that we need permission to step forward. I think sometimes we have to give ourselves that permission internally. But it's just about feeling confident, but also about feeling, for me, it's about feeling safe, that you can step forward, you can expose your identity. And I think increasingly a lot of more younger women are starting to talk like that. You know, there's obviously so many various waves of feminism, first, second, third, fourth. There's a dialogue there, but I think ultimately it's about equality, that we are all equal, or at least we should be. And I think if you have that in your core, and we can, through these films, through anything at the UN, through anything we can do in the media, from someone like Greta, it's not necessarily that she's a young girl, it's what she's saying. And it's how she's saying it, and it's how we're listening. But it's about, I think it is about permission, but it's about confidence. So who came before me? Who came before you? And how does that make you feel? You know, it's not in the clip, but Hillary Clinton and Milan Verveer are interviewed on Wave Goodbye to Dinosaurs, and they tell an incredible story. The Women's Coalition and all the political parties in Northern Ireland, before they signed the Good Friday Agreement, were invited over to the White House for St. Patrick's Day celebrations. There was, at that point, 9 parties really at the table. President Clinton met with all of the 8 parties, who were all men, but somehow they forgot about the Women's Coalition. So the Women's Coalition were left outside the room. They rang the First Lady. Milan Verveer ran down and got Monica and Pearl into the room. I think it was meant to last 30 minutes. The conversation lasted 3 hours. And the word emboldened was used, that the First Lady felt emboldened by Monica and Pearl, but you both felt emboldened coming out of that room. In hearing that, it makes me feel emboldened. And I think if we can do that through any means, then we will come forward. And you know, it's just about feeling safe in doing so. But if there are more young women like Greta in the world, I think we're going to be fine.
No, I think the only thing that I would say that in the process of making this film, and also just being part of the series and being surrounded by all these incredible women, I think that the like sexism and sexism is basically the fabric of our society, right? And coming from, you know, I'm a South Asian woman, it's the fabric of the society that I come from originally, and it's still the fabric of Western society. And I think it's not enough, obviously, just to be, you know, anti-sexist. You also have to be pro-women. Those go hand in hand, and in every decision you make, it's just. And when we talk about race, this is also the same thing. We talk about it's not enough just to be, you know, when you deal with racism, you can't just say, well, I'm anti-racist. You know, you also, you know, when you're talking about racism, I should say anti-blackness, you have to also be pro-black. You also have to be. You cannot just. And that has to weigh into your everyday decisions, you know, on a, from the smallest things to the biggest, you know, where you buy your coffee every morning, where, you know, to the much larger decisions, like who sits at the table for the, you know, an election, and who gets to come to the table for like a peace process. So this is the thing, I think it's, and for the women from my part of the world, speaking out can mean that you die, you know, that it's a life or death. It's really, so I think, and that's always been ingrained in me, so I feel like we have to carry that with us as women. It's an ongoing battle, you know, unfortunately we can't rest, we have to constantly make it better for the next generation.
Thanks, Sarah. Just one last quick thought, and that's actually to answer the question from our South Sudan colleague with regards to that question about where we can't find the qualified women. That is the line that gets told to women in every peace process consistently, but not just in peace processes, in leadership roles across the board. But when it comes to peace processes, who is it that is at the community level in Syria negotiating ceasefires so that humanitarian assistance can come in and feed families? Who is it that is sustaining communities on a daily basis in conflict zones? What is it that we mean by qualified? And I think that's why it's so important that we shift the conversation. How do we make peace? By putting armed, mainly men, around a table. That doesn't make sense. And so what do we mean when we say qualified? And I think that's why it's so important that these exchanges, that this cross-learning happens, and that these coalitions happen across countries as well, to support each other, to start shifting that conversation and asking the questions back about who's qualified at the table to build peace at the moment. But I think it's such an important question to ask.
That brings us to the end of the program. I'm left with the importance of continuity and learning across regions, across identities, across ages, and listening and learning from each other. I'm left with the vital importance of creativity, of knowing that you're not alone and standing and doing this together when you're doing the risky work. And most of all, the language of hope. So with that, thank you so much, all of you.